8 hours to her wedding. My daughter sent me a message. She said, "Don't come to the wedding. My in-laws don't like you." I smiled and did not text back. They didn't know I secretly owned the event center. 30 minutes to the wedding, they also received an unexpected message that changed everything. I will tell you how it all unfolded. First, let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout out in our next story. Today's special shout out goes to Eddie Johnson from South Carolina. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. 8 hours to the wedding. My daughter's text turned the world quiet around me. It wasn't the words she sent, those 6 blunt sentences that told me everything and nothing at all, but the echo of every silence we'd shared in the past few years. She wrote, "Don't come to the wedding. My in-laws don't like you." I read it 3 times, my thumb hovering over the screen like I might write back, but I didn't. I just sat there with my phone buzzing in my hand, feeling how small and final that message made me feel. It wasn't even a conversation, just a decree, and it was as if every mile I'd walked to build something for her, to be there for her, had been erased by her sudden, polite rejection. Outside, the sky was split open with June sun, but I remember the coldness in my chest was all I could feel, like a winter that had never really ended. I didn't tell anyone about the text. I didn't even breathe it out loud. Instead, I closed my phone and stood up from the table where I'd been sketching out last-minute changes to the event center's layout. The center had been mine for 10 years, built up from nothing but a loan and a promise to myself that no one would ever see me as disposable again. I built every corner of that place with my hands, from the polished floors to the old brass chandeliers that flickered in the hallways. And now it was where my daughter would marry a man whose family didn't think I deserved to stand at her side. I looked around the space, my space, and felt a sharp, cutting ache that I didn't let show. The staff were busy setting up, folding napkins into neat triangles, and rolling out white tablecloths like they were laying out a story that didn't include me. I watched them for a moment longer, then stepped outside to let the air clear the thickness in my chest. My daughter's message wasn't just a rejection, it was a dismissal of who I was. I remembered every night I spent in this building, sleeping on a cot in the back office because I couldn't afford rent and wages at the same time. The sweat that stained my collar, the cuts on my hands from fixing a broken pipe at midnight because no one else would. And all of that, my years of grinding, my quiet triumphs, none of it meant anything to her in that text. She was a child when I first bought this place, her small hand in mine as I showed her the empty rooms and promised her one day they'd be filled with light and music. Now, she was a woman who had decided my presence was an inconvenience she couldn't risk offending her new family with. I let the weight of that settle in my gut, feeling how it pressed against my ribs like a truth I couldn't swallow down. I didn't text back. There was nothing to say to her that wouldn't feel like begging, and I was done with begging for a place in her life. Instead, I turned my phone off and slipped it into my pocket, forcing myself to keep moving. I walked the perimeter of the event center, checking the flowers in the garden, white peonies and soft blush roses, the same ones she'd chosen for the wedding. They looked almost too fragile in the June heat, petals already starting to wilt at the edges. I wondered if she'd notice, if she'd remember how much she'd wanted them to look perfect. A part of me wanted to fix them, to water them, to save them. But another part of me knew it wasn't my job to keep them alive if she'd already decided they weren't my concern. At 3 p.m., I went back inside and watched the rehearsal from the balcony. They didn't see me, I made sure of that. My daughter laughed with her soon-to-be husband, his parents fussing over the seating chart and the canapes like they were arranging a coronation. I watched her smile, bright and unburdened, and I wondered if she'd thought about me at all in that moment. If she'd felt even a flicker of guilt when she sent that message. Probably not. Or maybe she had, and that was why she hadn't said anything more. The silence was the real message. The place she'd made for me was nowhere. And that was something I couldn't change by showing up or staying away. I left before they finished rehearsing. The weight of the place felt heavier than I'd ever known, like every inch of it was pressing down on me. I went back to my office at the far end of the building, the door with my name on it in small brass letters no one ever really looked at. I sat at my desk and pulled open the drawer where I kept the picture of the house I'd bought for her. A small white farmhouse on the edge of town, just big enough to start a family. I'd signed the papers last week, imagining the look on her face when I handed her the keys. I thought I'd see the child in her again, the one who used to squeal with excitement at the smallest things, the one who used to look at me like I was her whole world. I thought I'd see gratitude, maybe even love. But her text told me everything I needed to know about what I meant to her now. As I traced the edges of that photo, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet sort of resolve that didn't need words or permission. She might not want me there, but this was still my place, my ground. I'd spent years turning this building into a sanctuary for other people's memories, and I wasn't about to let someone else tell me I didn't belong in it. Even if I didn't stand in the front row, even if my name wasn't on the invitation, I would still be there. Not for her approval, not for theirs. Just for me. The quiet, steady truth of who I was. I didn't know what that would look like yet, but I knew I wouldn't be pushed out of my own story. And when the day came, when the music started and the doors opened, I would be there, watching, waiting, and maybe, just maybe, taking back a little of what was mine. I didn't tell anyone about what I was planning. The morning of the wedding, I watched the final deliveries arrive. The florist van, the catering truck, a dozen bright-eyed servers carrying boxes of linens like they were pieces of someone else's dream. I didn't interfere. I didn't even step onto the floor where the decorators were fussing with every last detail. Instead, I let them work around me, invisible in my own building. There was something almost comforting in that, watching them move as if I didn't exist, their laughter and chatter a soft white noise that reminded me how easy it was to be unseen. I've lived most of my life like that, half in the shadows, half in the glare of other people's expectations. It was a role I knew too well. The night before, I had gone home to my small apartment, the place I'd retreated to after the divorce. It was a simple space, dark wood floors, a worn leather couch, and walls that still smelled faintly of paint and possibility. I'd sat on that couch for hours, the picture of the house in my hand, tracing the lines of the porch railings and the bright white shutters that would never frame my daughter's windows. The silence was heavy, but I didn't turn on the TV or play music to fill it. I let it be as it was, thick, absolute. Like the final word in a conversation I didn't want to keep having. By the time dawn came, I'd made my choice. I wouldn't announce my presence, but I wouldn't hide either. I would be there in the back, where the shadows meet the light, the place I'd always found myself standing anyway. And maybe that was all I needed. To know that even if she'd chosen to erase me from her picture-perfect day, I wouldn't erase myself. I wouldn't let her shame me into silence. I dressed carefully that morning, dark slacks, a crisp white shirt, and the one tie I still bothered to keep pressed. It was the same tie I'd worn when I signed the papers on the event center, a quiet symbol of every risk I'd taken to build this life from the ground up. I smoothed it down with a slow breath, feeling how the knot at my throat was like a small defiance. My reflection in the mirror looked older than I remembered. Lines at the corners of my eyes that hadn't been there when she was still a child, a heaviness in my shoulders that hadn't existed when I was just starting out. But there was something else too, a steadiness in the set of my mouth, a calm in the darkness of my eyes that said I knew exactly who I was, even if she didn't. By 9 a.m., I was back at the event center, slipping in through the service entrance the way I always had. My staff knew me, but they didn't question me. They were used to my quiet presence, the way I walked through the building like I was part of the walls themselves. I nodded to the manager as I passed, his eyes flickering with the question he didn't ask. I didn't offer an explanation. Instead, I went straight to my office and closed the door behind me. The office was small but comfortable, lined with ledgers and contracts, the air faintly scented with the warm wood polish I used every Friday without fail. I sat down at the desk, the picture of the house in my hand again. It felt like a weight and a promise all at once. A symbol of what I'd tried to give her, what I'd been ready to lay at her feet in the hope she might see me as more than just a name on the deed. But now, it was also a reminder that love isn't something you can force someone to see. Sometimes, love is the quiet act of letting them go when they've already decided to walk away. The minutes crawled by in that office, every tick of the clock a small echo of the decision I'd made. I didn't check my phone. I didn't check the email stacking up in my inbox. I sat with the quiet and let it become a kind of shield. If there was pain in that stillness, there was also a strength I hadn't known I could find. A man can spend his whole life begging for scraps of belonging from people who only see him as an embarrassment, or he can decide to take up space on his own terms. That was the choice I was making now. At noon, the manager knocked on my door. He was a young man, nervous, always polite. He hesitated before he spoke, his voice low and careful. "Sir, the in-laws have requested to meet with the CEO. They've heard rumors, and they're concerned." He didn't say what they were really worried about, that I might ruin the illusion of their perfect day, that my presence might remind them they didn't hold all the cards. I looked at him and gave a small, steady smile. "Tell them the CEO will be present, and that he has a gift." I watched the flicker of understanding in his eyes as he nodded and left the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that felt like the final note in a song I'd been playing for years. Alone again, I leaned back in my chair, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of my own breath. The weight of the picture in my hand was less of a burden now, more like a totem, a quiet reminder of everything I'd built with my own two hands. My daughter's wedding was supposed to be a celebration, but for me, it had become something else, a moment to reclaim the parts of myself I'd spent too long burying for her comfort. I wasn't there to disrupt her day, but I wasn't going to pretend I didn't exist. My name was on the deed, my sweat in every beam of the building, and my heart in every decision I'd made to keep it alive. If that wasn't enough for her, then it would have to be enough for me. As the afternoon light shifted and the first guests began to arrive, I stayed in my office, tracing the lines of the house one last time. I thought about how easily a home can become a prison when the people inside it refuse to see you, and how sometimes the only way to find your freedom is to stop waiting for someone else to open the door. When I finally stood up and slipped the picture into my jacket pocket, I felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't known I was capable of. This wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about standing in the quiet power of my own worth. No apologies, no explanations. I left the office and walked down the back hallway, the soft hum of voices in the distance. My steps were measured, my heart steady. Outside, the sun was bright and merciless, but inside, I felt something almost like peace. She had chosen to vanish me from her story, but I wouldn't vanish from my own. I would be there, in the shadows, in the stillness, waiting to see how the day would end, and ready to claim whatever peace I could find in the truth of who I was. By 3 p.m., the building was humming with a low, nervous energy that felt almost electric. I could hear the music starting in the main hall, the soft strains of a piano weaving through the air like a thread pulling everything together. I walked the back halls in silence, the click of my shoes on the polished floors the only sound that belonged to me alone. It was a strange feeling, standing in the middle of everything I'd built, knowing I was both the architect and the ghost of the story they were writing without me. But I didn't let the bitterness take root. I'd spent too long letting other people's choices define the weight of my own steps. Today, I decided I would carry only what was mine. I found the manager in the small office near the kitchen, going over the final details of the seating arrangements. His eyes flicked up when I walked in, and I saw the quick flash of uncertainty there. "Sir," he started, but I held up a hand to stop him. "It's all right," I said. My voice was calm, the kind of calm that comes when you've spent the night wrestling with your own ghosts and decided you're done letting them win. "I need you to send them a message," I told him, and the words felt heavy and deliberate, like I was chiseling them out of stone. "Tell them the CEO will be present at the wedding, and that he has a gift." His eyebrows lifted slightly, but he didn't question me. That was what I liked about him. He knew when to hold his tongue. I watched him tap the message into his phone, his fingers moving fast but careful, like he knew the weight of every letter. As he sent the message, I felt something inside me shift, a quiet realignment of the pieces of myself I'd let get scattered in the past few weeks. It wasn't about making a scene or exacting revenge. It was about reclaiming the dignity I'd spent a lifetime building. She might not want me there, but I would not be erased. I would not be a ghost in my own story. The message was a small act, but it was also a promise to myself that I wouldn't be silent when I had something to say. After he sent it, I thanked him and walked out into the garden, where the flowers were still trying to bloom in the June heat. The peonies were drooping, their petals soft and bruised, and I felt a flicker of sympathy for them. I'd always liked those flowers, fragile and stubborn all at once, blooming even when the weather tried to crush them. I bent down and brushed a petal with my thumb, feeling how delicate it was, how easily it could be crushed by a careless touch. It reminded me of my daughter, how she used to cling to my leg when she was small, her small hands clinging to my pants like they were the only safe thing in the world. I wondered when that changed, when I stopped being her safe place and became the person she was embarrassed to claim. I stood there for a while, letting the warmth of the sun settle into my skin. The air smelled of roses and grass and a faint tang of something sweet from the kitchen, but underneath it all was the scent of sweat and nerves that always clung to the edges of a wedding. It was a scent I'd come to know well over the years, hope and fear tangled together, too knotted to ever really pull apart. I closed my eyes and breathed it in, feeling how it settled in my lungs like a truth I'd been trying not to say out loud. I wasn't here to ruin her day. I was here to reclaim my place in the story, even if it was just for a moment. When I went back inside, the hall was starting to fill up. Guests moved in slow currents, laughter and hushed voices blending into a soft murmur that filled every corner. I stayed in the shadows at the back, my eyes tracing the lines of the room I'd designed. The high arches, the warm light that pooled in the corners, the small details I'd spent hours perfecting. Every inch of it was mine, a testament to the years I'd spent carving out a place in the world that no one could take away. I let that thought steady me, like a quiet mantra. This was mine. No one could rewrite that truth. I saw her then, my daughter, standing near the altar, her white dress a soft glow in the light. She was beautiful, and for a moment, it hurt to look at her. She was everything I'd hoped for, everything I'd wanted to protect from the sharp edges of the world. And she was also the one who had asked me to vanish from her life, to pretend I didn't exist. I wondered if she could feel me watching her, if some small part of her still knew the weight of my eyes on her back. But she didn't turn. She didn't look for me. At that moment, I felt the quiet edge of something inside me harden, like a line I'd been too afraid to draw before. I realized that I wasn't there to beg her to see me. I wasn't there to earn back a place in her world. I was there to remind myself that even if she didn't want me, I still belonged to myself. That was the midpoint of the day, the moment when the ache in my chest turned into something else, something fierce and unbreakable. I was done asking for permission to exist. The manager found me again a few minutes later, his expression careful. "They got the message," he said. I could hear the unspoken question in his voice. What would happen now? But I just nodded, feeling a calm settle over me like a second skin. "Good," I said. That's all I needed. I didn't tell him what I'd planned for the end of the night, the quiet final act that would be mine alone. I didn't need to. Some things are too private to share, too sacred to be spoken out loud. I stayed in the back of the room, watching as the music swelled and the last of the guests took their seats. My heart was steady, my breath even. In that moment, I wasn't the father she'd turned away. I wasn't the man they didn't want at the table. I was the architect of the space they stood in, the quiet witness to every word they'd speak. And I knew, without any doubt, that I was done being invisible. The wedding started with a hush that settled over the room like a spell, the music swelling to fill the silence that had pressed so heavy on my chest all morning. I slipped into a seat at the very back, my body folding itself into the shadows where no one would think to look. My heart was a steady drum in my ears, but my face was calm, the practiced mask of a man who's learned how to disappear in a room full of people who never wanted him there. Around me, the guests leaned forward in their chairs, the low murmur of conversation trailing off as the doors opened and she walked down the aisle. She looked radiant, every inch of her the careful, perfect bride she'd been taught to be. White lace clung to her shoulders, and her hair was pinned back in soft curls that brushed her cheeks with every step she took. I watched her eyes, searching for something there. Regret, apology, even just a flicker of the child who used to run to me when the world got too loud. But there was nothing. Her gaze was fixed ahead, on the man who waited for her at the end of the aisle, on the life she'd chosen that didn't have room for me anymore. I didn't flinch when she passed me. I didn't look away. In that moment, I let every silent hour I'd spent building this place rise up in my chest like a quiet vow. I would not be made small. My presence was not a stain to be hidden away. I felt the weight of the building around me, the soft hum of the lights, the faint echo of footsteps on the polished floor. The air scented faintly with roses and the sharp bite of champagne. Every inch of it had been shaped by my hands, every corner a testament to the nights I'd worked alone, carving out something I could be proud of. And in that moment, I let that pride be enough. The vows were soft, their voices steady, but I didn't really hear the words. My mind was elsewhere, on the quiet promise I'd made to myself that morning, on the picture of the house tucked inside my jacket, a symbol of what I'd been ready to give her before she decided it wasn't worth having. I felt the weight of it there, pressing against my ribs like a second heartbeat, and I let it remind me that love doesn't vanish just because it isn't wanted. It shifts, it changes shape, but it doesn't die. And neither would I. As the ceremony ended and the applause rose around them, I stood in the back, my hands folded in my lap, watching her smile at a man who wasn't me. I felt a flicker of something sharp in my chest. Jealousy, maybe, or just the cold ache of being left behind. But I didn't let it take me. I let it wash over me and then fade, like the last note of the song that had played too long in my head. I knew what I had to do next, and there was no room for hesitation. 30 minutes later, the reception began. The guests flooded into the main hall, laughter and music spilling into every corner. I stayed where I was, letting the tide of their celebration flow around me like I was just another shadow on the wall. I watched the in-laws, the way they moved through the room with practiced ease, their smiles wide and hollow, their eyes always scanning the crowd for any sign of imperfection. They had spent years polishing their image, and I could see how hard they were working to make sure no one noticed the cracks beneath the surface. But I saw them. I always had. The manager found me again, his face pale, his hand shaking just a little as he leaned down to whisper in my ear. "Sir," he said, his voice tight. "They're asking who the CEO is. They're nervous." I met his gaze and felt a small, cold smile tug at the corners of my mouth. "Let them be," I said, my voice a whisper that felt heavier than any shout. "Let them wonder." It was a small act of defiance, but it felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from me. A quiet reminder that I was still here, still watching, still holding the final card they'd never seen coming. When the time came for the speeches, I stayed in my seat at the back, listening to the laughter and applause that followed each polite toast. My daughter beamed at her new family, her smile wide and bright, but there was a tension in her shoulders I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was the weight of the day, or maybe it was the knowledge that somewhere in the room, I was waiting for my moment. I wondered if she was thinking about the message I'd sent, if she understood yet that this wasn't about ruining her day, it was about showing her that I wouldn't be erased. Finally, the master of ceremonies stepped forward, his voice ringing out above the music and the chatter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his smile practiced and smooth. "We have a very special guest with us today. The CEO of this beautiful event center has a gift to present to the bride and groom." A hush fell over the room, every head turning toward the back where I sat. I felt their eyes on me like a weight, but I didn't flinch. I stood up slowly, feeling the quiet power of that moment settle into my bones like an anchor. I let the silence stretch out, every second a quiet rebuke to the people who had decided I didn't matter. As I walked down the aisle, I saw the color drain from the in-laws' faces, their forced smiles faltering as they realized the truth of who I was. My daughter's eyes widened, her lips parting like she wanted to call out to me, to stop me. But she didn't say a word. She just watched, her hands clenched tight around the bouquet she held like it was the only thing tethering her to the ground. I reached the front of the room and turned to face them all, my hands calm at my sides, my heart steady. I pulled the picture of the house from my jacket and held it up for her to see. The new house I'd bought for her, the place I'd imagined would be the start of her new life. I saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the way her breath caught in her throat. She took a step forward, her voice a whisper I almost couldn't hear. "Dad, please," but it was too late for that now. My mind was already made. I looked at her, really looked, and in that moment, I saw not the daughter I'd tried so hard to protect, but the woman who had chosen to let me go. And I realized that was her right. It wasn't my job to fix what she didn't want me to be a part of. It was my job to know when to stop fighting for a place I was never meant to keep. I handed her the picture, my fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. "This was for you," I said, my voice quiet, but it carried in the sudden hush of the room. "But I've changed my mind." I didn't explain. I didn't have to. The weight of those words was enough to say everything I'd kept silent for too long. And with that, I turned and walked back down the aisle, the soft music starting up again behind me like a requiem for something I'd finally let die. My heart was steady. My breath was even. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was finally free. I walked out of the main hall, the weight of the picture gone from my pocket but not from my mind. The hush I left behind felt almost like an echo following me down the corridor, each step ringing with the finality of what I'd done. I didn't look back. There was nothing left in that room for me. Not the forced smiles, not the polite applause that would come when they tried to pretend everything was still perfect. I had given them their moment, and I had taken mine. And now it was time to let the dust settle. Outside the hall, the manager was waiting for me, his eyes wide with questions he didn't dare ask. "Sir," he started, his voice a careful whisper. They're shocked." I nodded, the smallest movement of my head. "Let them be," I said, my voice quiet but certain. I wasn't there to soothe their discomfort or to mend the cracks I'd split open with the truth. I was there to reclaim the dignity I'd spent too long giving away. And in that still hallway, I felt it settle in my chest like a quiet kind of peace. I stepped outside into the bright June air, the sun sharp and hot on my skin. The garden was empty, the peonies drooping in the heat like they were too tired to keep standing tall. I sat down on the low stone wall that edged the flower beds and let the silence wrap around me. It wasn't the bitter silence of rejection, not anymore. It was the calm that comes when you finally decide you don't owe anyone your presence if they can't hold it with care. The breeze carried the scent of roses and champagne, the distant hum of laughter and music drifting out through the open doors. But out here, in the quiet, it felt like the first real breath I'd taken all day. A few minutes later, the door opened behind me. I didn't turn. I knew the sound of her footsteps before I heard her voice. She came to stand beside me, her white dress catching the light, her bouquet clutched tight in her hands like a shield. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. I could feel her trying to find the right words, the ones that would bridge the chasm she'd put between us with that one text, 8 hours ago. But there are some things words can't fix. Some choices that don't have a way back. "Dad," she said finally, her voice low and careful, like she was afraid of shattering the moment. "Please don't go." "I didn't mean." She stopped, the words catching in her throat. I turned to look at her then, really look. I saw the shimmer of tears at the corners of her eyes, the tight set of her mouth that said she was trying so hard to hold on to the day she'd planned. For a moment, I almost reached out to her, almost let the years of wanting to be the man she could turn to soften the steel in my chest. But I didn't. "You didn't mean to hurt me," I said quietly, and I could see how the truth of it landed on her shoulders like a weight she didn't know how to carry. "But you did." I let the words settle between us, heavy and sharp. "And now, I think it's time you carried the part of it that belongs to you." She shook her head, her hands twisting around the bouquet. "Dad," I was scared. "I thought if they saw you, if they thought you didn't fit." She stopped again, her eyes wide and pleading. I didn't want to lose this day. Her voice was a whisper, but it cut through me just the same. Because I understood. I'd spent most of my life trying to make sure other people didn't lose the things they thought they needed. I just never realized it meant I'd have to lose myself in the process. "I know," I said, my voice steady, even though my chest felt like it might crack open. "But I won't let you make me small to keep your place in their story." The wind shifted, lifting the edge of her veil so it brushed against my arm. It felt like a ghost of the little girl she'd once been, the one who used to hold my hand without shame. I let the memory settle, then let it go. She reached for me then, her fingers brushing mine, and I felt the tremble in her touch. "Please, Dad," she said again, and there was something so raw in her voice it almost undid me. "I don't want you to leave like this." But I knew leaving wasn't the real betrayal. Staying and pretending everything was fine, staying and letting her believe she could choose when I was allowed to be her father, that would have been the real betrayal. And I was done with that. I pulled my hand back, the quiet motion sharper than any slap. I've already left, I said softly. I left the moment you decided I wasn't worth fighting for. The truth of it settled over us like a final benediction, and I saw her flinch as the weight of it pressed down. But I didn't apologize. Some truths aren't meant to be softened. The door opened behind her again, and her new husband stepped out, his expression wary. He looked from her to me and back again, his mouth opening like he wanted to speak, to fix the fracture he could see but didn't understand. But I didn't give him the chance. I stood up, my shoulders straight, the quiet surety of my choice holding me steady. Take care of her, I said to him, my voice calm but unyielding. She's stronger than she knows. Don't let her forget that. He nodded, his eyes wide with something like respect, or maybe just fear. It didn't matter. I wasn't saying it for him. I turned and walked down the path that led away from the garden, each step feeling like a release. The music swelled behind me, laughter and applause rising up to fill the space I was leaving behind. But none of it touched me. I walked past the peonies, their petals falling soft and silent to the ground, and I felt something in me fall away too. Not love. I would never stop loving her. But the need to be seen by her, the ache for a place at her table, that was done. And in its place, I felt the quiet, steady beat of my own worth. When I reached the edge of the property, I paused for a moment, turning to look back at the building I'd built with my own hands. The place that had been my sanctuary, my legacy, my proof that I was more than the man they'd tried to make me. And in that moment, I knew I didn't have to fight to prove it anymore. It was enough that I knew it. It was enough that I could stand there, alone and unashamed, and know that I had never really been small. I just needed to stop waiting for her to see it. I didn't look back as I walked away from the event center, the sun hanging low and gold in the sky, casting long shadows across the stone path. The air was warm, and I could smell the faint sweetness of the roses, the faint echo of music and laughter that drifted out from the open doors. Each step felt like shedding a skin I'd worn too long. Each breath a small reclaiming of the quiet power I'd kept hidden in the corners of my chest. I had spent years building a life for other people. Rooms and halls and gardens designed to hold their memories, their joys, their triumphs. And for once, I let myself believe that I didn't have to stand in the back of my own story. I drove home in silence, the picture of the house still heavy in my jacket pocket, even though it no longer felt like a gift. It felt like a reminder of how easily love can turn into something you use to buy your way into someone else's life, and how sometimes the only real gift you can give is to let them go. The road was quiet, the late afternoon light turning the fields to bronze, and I let the hum of the engine fill the spaces where the ache used to be. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to be everything she needed, the nights I'd stayed up fixing the smallest details just so she'd know I was still there, even if she never said it out loud. But today, I saw the truth I'd been too afraid to name. Love doesn't always mean belonging. And sometimes, belonging isn't worth the cost. When I reached my apartment, I stood at the door for a long moment, the keys cool and solid in my hand. The quiet there felt different than the silence of the wedding hall, less like an exile and more like a choice. I stepped inside, the smell of old wood and faint paint welcoming me back. I slipped off my jacket and laid it carefully over the chair, pulling the picture of the house from the pocket. I set it on the table, tracing the lines of the white porch and the bright shutters that would never frame her windows. I let my hand rest there for a moment, then I turned away. It didn't belong to her anymore, and maybe it never really did. I walked through the small apartment, each step an echo of a life I'd tried so hard to make big enough for both of us. The walls were bare except for a single painting. A quiet seascape in muted blues and grays, the waves crashing soft against a rocky shore. I'd bought it years ago, long before the event center, long before I ever thought about how heavy a father's love could be. It had always reminded me of the way the world can be both fierce and calm, both endless and contained. I stood there for a long time, letting that image settle in my chest, feeling the way it mirrored the quiet strength I'd found in myself today. As the sun began to set, I took the picture of the house and slid it into the drawer of my desk, the small click of the wood a final note in the song I'd been playing for too long. I didn't need to see it anymore. I didn't need to hold on to what it meant. It was enough to know that I'd tried, that I'd given her everything I could, and that when she asked me to disappear, I'd found the courage to walk away instead of fading out. That kind of quiet, I realized, is the only kind that matters. The kind that says I don't need to be chosen to know my own worth. Outside, the last of the light was slipping below the horizon, the sky deepening to a dark, velvety blue. I stepped out onto the small balcony, the cool air brushing against my skin, and I let myself breathe in the night. I thought about the event center, the laughter and music that would carry on without me. I thought about my daughter, her eyes wide with something like regret, the way she had reached for me too late. And I let it all be what it was, a chapter one had written, and now, a chapter one was closing. I stayed there until the stars began to appear, each one a small, steady promise that there is always light in the darkness, always a way to find your way back to yourself. And in that quiet, I felt something in me settle, something that had been restless for too long. I wasn't the father she needed me to be, not in the way she wanted. But I was still the man I had fought to become. I was still the one who had built something lasting with his own two hands, the one who had learned how to stand in the shadows without letting them swallow him whole. When I finally turned to go back inside, I felt a calm I hadn't known in years. It was a quiet sort of power, the kind that doesn't shout or demand to be seen. The kind that says, I am enough. I don't have to prove it to anyone else. If you've ever had to make a choice that hurt but felt right, you'll understand this story. I share stories like this every day, quiet moments of truth, loss, and the power to walk away. Hit that subscribe button and stick around. We're just getting started. See you soon in the next story.